A reminder that in a change to our schedule, we join Ryan for Tubridy tonight at 20 to 12 midnight here on RTE1. But now, the 6-1 News.
Good evening and welcome to 6-1 live from the Vatican. The body of Pope John Paul II is moved to St. Peter's Basilica, where he will lie in state for the next 4 days. The Pontiff's funeral will take place on Friday. He will be buried in the crypt of St. Peter's in the Vatican.
And in other news, Gamma workers protest outside the Dáil. The company insists they have not been underpaid. And an inquest has begun into the death of a Mayo man who received natural health treatment for cancer.
Pope John Paul II is this evening lying in state beneath the high altar here at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church who've travelled here over the last few days, a little earlier today, formally announced that the Pope's funeral will take place on Friday morning. Then Pope John Paul II will be laid to rest among his predecessors in the crypt of St. Peter's here in the Vatican. A little earlier this afternoon there were extraordinary scenes as the Pope's body was borne from the Apostolic Palace here at the Vatican down the great staircase, accompanied by pallbearers, a guard of honour from the Swiss Guard, senior churchmen and senior figures from the Curia here in Rome, taken down out into the square at St. Peter's, where thousands of pilgrims have been gathering over the last number of days, and this afternoon had their final glimpse of their beloved John Paul II. Tears, prayers, final tributes from those who've gathered here. The Pope, born around St. Peter's, this historic square where so many times he himself had mingled among the people. It was his practice at the conclusion of great occasions here to move among the crowd, to travel round the square, to come close to his people. On one such occasion, of course, he was struck by an assassin's bullet, surviving that attack and ruling as Supreme Pontiff for more than a quarter of a century, now making his final journey across the square and up the steps towards the entrance to the Basilica, beneath the velvet curtain and into the great church here, the great centre of Catholicism. And for the next 4 days he will lie in state in front of the altar of confessions, above the grave of St. Peter, whose shoes he has filled for the last 26 years. And then the funeral on Friday morning, to be attended by church leaders and dignitaries, political leaders from all around the world. With our first report this evening, our Europe editor Sean Whelan has been following the day's events.
A day for ceremony and a day for decisions at the Vatican. This morning the cardinals met for the first time. 65 of the church's top prelates held 2 meetings, one to set Friday as the day of the papal funeral, the other to arrange the running of the church up to the installation of a successor.
The cardinals during the next 15 or 20 days will be meeting in what they call general meetings to discuss exactly what they see the challenges facing the church are in the next decade or two, and the style of papacy that they hope for.
From early morning, people came to St. Peter's, forming queues to get into the Basilica for the public lying in state. Just after 5 o'clock local time, the Pope's remains were borne from the Apostolic Palace. Accompanied by the cardinals, flanked by the Swiss Guard, the body of John Paul II emerged from the private world of the official residence into the piazza and the people. The remains of the Pope will lie in state until the funeral on Friday morning. The great Basilica will stay open night and day for the public to file past and see this most visible of pontiffs one last time. Prayers were led by the Camerlengo, now the chief administrator of the church, Cardinal Eduardo Martinez Somalo. The chief concelebrant at Friday's funeral will be Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the Dean of the College of Cardinals and one of John Paul's closest collaborators. The Polish Pope will then be laid to rest beneath St. Peter's. Friday's funeral is expected to be one of the biggest and most prestigious ever held, with heads of state and government flying in from all parts of the world. They'll join as many as 2 million ordinary men and women in paying their final respects to Pope John Paul II. Sean Whelan, RTE News, the Vatican.
Lebanon and Egypt have joined Cuba in declaring 3 days of national mourning in remembrance of Pope John Paul II. Across the world, millions of people are continuing to mourn at the Pope's passing, as Michal Lahan reports.
Flags were flying at half-mast in the Philippines today, where the passing of Pope John Paul II has led to an outpouring of grief in a country where 80% of the population is Catholic. And the country's president has declared a national period of mourning in memory of the Pope, who attracted huge crowds during his 2 visits there. The story is similar in many parts of Asia, where the church is growing rapidly. But in China, where many attended masses after the news of the pontiff's death, the main discussion websites have blocked prayers and other comments on the death being posted on the internet. One of the websites insisted the move was their own initiative and the government did not ask them to do it. The Chinese government has sent its condolences to the Vatican. In Nigeria, where there are hopes that the next pope might be African, one of the country's leading cardinals today prayed for a pontiff who he said would understand the present trend of thought. He also had praise for the late John Paul II.
He's managed to mend the fences and bring things together. People are talking about abortion, talking about this and talking about that. Now he's bringing them all together.
There was a minute's silence at a meeting of the UN Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. High Commissioner Louise Arbour said she hoped the Pope would be remembered and inspire all in his quest for peace. Michal Lahan, RTE News.
Well, I'm joined now by our religious affairs correspondent Joe Little, who was down in St. Peter's Square during what we saw a little earlier, the carrying of the Pope through the square. Joe, first of all, a comment about what we saw there. I imagine the Pope would have played a part in arranging what we're seeing unfolding here.
Absolutely. The symbolism was very poignant and very apt. The Pope was dressed in the red chasuble of the bishop with his white mitre, and tucked under his arm was the papal staff we've seen him so often lean upon on his papal journeys, at the top of which was the figure of Christ crucified. Entwined around his fingers were the rosary beads. And these highlighted the major themes of his pontificate: his devotion to Christ and to his mother, and his insistence on prayer as the central feature of Catholicism. Then when he was brought to the steps by those pallbearers, as the priests, bishops and cardinals chanted the litany of saints, one was reminded that he was a pope who had created more saints in his own 26 years as pope than all the popes put together since the modern form of canonization was introduced some 800 or more years ago. Then he was turned 180 degrees on those steps of St. Peter's, back towards the square, which, as you said, he had made his own, towards the people who, around the perimeter of the square and the streets and the environs of the Vatican, the crowds had gathered and were watching this on large screens. Many of them had come on long train journeys overnight to try to get to the top of the queue, or near the top of the queue, so that they could file past his remains later on.
Joe, what about the mood of those people? Because I think it would be wrong to say that there's an enormous outpouring of dark grief. Here was a man who had lived many years and ruled for a long period as pontiff, but there is certainly a mood of reflection and of sadness, no doubt.
There is, and I suppose there is an anxiety that such a great figure may be very difficult to replace. And I think I saw in the faces of some of the people who greeted us as journalists as we crossed through the crowds on the way to this interview, I saw on their faces, tiredness. They had spent a long time getting here, and perhaps worry. And it'll be a big outpouring of grief, I think, when they do get in. I spoke to a journalist who viewed his remains in the Clementine Hall, and she said he was very emaciated and looked as if he had suffered a lot. And I think that will bring a great outpouring of grief.
All right, Joe, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. And that's all indeed from the Vatican for the moment, but we'll have more a little later in this programme. Back now to you, Eileen, in the studio.
Thanks, Brian. Here, the Taoiseach has said that while there won't be a national day of mourning to mark the death of the Pope, schools will be allowed to close on Friday for the funeral if they want to. He also said that arrangements could be made for employees in the public sector to attend any special services on Friday morning. Mr Ahern said he hoped the private sector would do the same.
The Taoiseach was among the first to sign the Book of Condolences for Pope John Paul II at the Apostolic Nunciature this morning, but as he was paying his respects, a controversy was emerging over whether or not there should be a formal national day of mourning on Friday, the day of the Pope's funeral.
Surely we're not so materialistic and focused on money as a nation. Surely we want our young people to know that we can take one day, 8 hours of a working day, to stand in solidarity with the man who stood in solidarity with us.
We would welcome some minutes silence. We would welcome that churches would open 24 hours a day, that books of condolences would be available, and that people can show their respect in the normal way. However, we do not feel that it would be appropriate that businesses would be told to close and that trading would cease on that particular day.
On the streets, opinion was divided.
I actually think there should be a national day of mourning here. Principally, not just because we're all Catholics, but we're all Christians.
It's nice to, I suppose, reflect on his death, but I think you don't need a day off to do that.
At lunchtime, the Taoiseach clarified the position. Schools will be allowed to close for the day if their boards of management wish, without having to make the day up later. Public servants will be facilitated in taking time off on Friday for religious services, and private sector employers will be encouraged to do the same. But people will not be getting the entire day off.
The requirements to close the entire country for the day, I don't quite frankly think it's either necessary or something that if people wish to go to Mass on the day.
The Taoiseach said we wouldn't have a national day of mourning. Then he said that some schools might be off and that some public servants could attend at ceremonies. And now he says that we should have a period of national mourning. What does he mean?
Flags will remain at half-mast until after Friday's funeral, and the government has urged people to find time for reflection on the life of Pope John Paul II. But while calls for a more formalised day of mourning may continue, the Taoiseach has pointed out that the same arrangements applied after the death of Pope John XXIII 42 years ago. David McCullough, RTE News, Government Buildings.
In Britain, it's been announced that Prince Charles will be representing Queen Elizabeth at the Pope's funeral on Friday. His wedding in Windsor to Camilla Parker Bowles has now been put back by one day until Saturday. Tony Blair, who will also attend the funeral today, postponed his announcement of a general election.
Today, the Prince of Wales and Mrs Parker Bowles were at Westminster Cathedral for a memorial service for the Pope led by Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. Prince Charles had cut short a Swiss skiing holiday to attend this Vespers service, and his wedding, which had been scheduled for Friday morning at Windsor, will now take place on Saturday. This means that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, who will also be attending the Pope's funeral, will still be able to oversee a ceremony of blessing for the Prince and Camilla Parker Bowles on Saturday afternoon following their civil marriage. Tony Blair and other political leaders were also at the London memorial service. Mr Blair had been expected to announce formally today the May 5th date for the British general election. That announcement has now been put off until tomorrow as a mark of respect. The Prime Minister, who is not a Catholic himself, but whose wife and children are Catholics, will be in Rome for the funeral on Friday. Prince Charles's staff said today that he had a lot of respect for the Pope and that the funeral would always take priority over his wedding. It's also likely that all political campaigning in Britain will be suspended on Friday as a mark of respect. That means that the general election here won't get underway properly until next week. Brian O'Connell, RTE News at Westminster Cathedral.
In other news, around 400 Turkish workers at the multinational firm Gamma Construction took to the streets of Dublin today in protest at what they say are unfair rates of pay at the company. The workers were also demanding information about monies paid into accounts in Finance Bank in Holland in their names. However, Gamma said it was writing to the workers in Turkish, confirming that the money was theirs and explaining how they could access it.
Around 400 Gamma workers marched through Dublin City this morning, protesting at what they say are unfair rates of pay at the multinational construction company.
The reason we are here today is to get our justice from Gamma, and we will fight till we finish this, till we get all it is, till we get our justice.
The workers say that before they left Turkey they were offered a basic wage of €2.20 an hour, plus €100 a month and food and accommodation, with no limit on the number of hours worked. They also say they signed documents opening accounts at a Dutch bank without realising what they were signing. They now want access to the money held there in their names. However, in a statement issued this afternoon, Gamma Construction denied its workers are underpaid and said that money which was paid into Dutch bank accounts with the agreement of workers is available to them. Gamma also said that the terms of employment and therefore the work permits of 140 of its workers based in Dublin have now expired and that they're to be repatriated back to Turkey. The company said the workers can have access to funds held in offshore accounts prior to or after returning to Turkey, and they also said they'll be issuing letters in Turkish to all employees telling them how to get access to their money. But workers at Gamma want representatives from Finance Bank to come here to explain their options to them and to give them full information about all investments in their names, which they claim could amount to up to €30 million. A further protest at a Gamma project at Tina in Galway is planned for tomorrow. Sinead Crowley, RTE News.
Still to come, more from the Vatican. We'll be talking to two experienced Vatican watchers, Father Tom Casey and Father Gregory Waldrop.
A new report on the country's bus sector says it's anti-competitive and restrictive, and Gardaí investigating the murder of a man in Dublin's south inner city last night believe it was connected to a personal dispute. Welcome back. You're watching 6-1 News, and the main stories this evening. Pope John Paul's body has been brought into St. Peter's Basilica, where it will lie in state for 3 days. The Basilica will remain open 21 hours a day for mourners. The funeral will take place on Friday at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Pope John Paul will be buried in St. Peter's Crypt in the Vatican. And here, around 400 Turkish workers at the multinational firm Gamma Construction have been protesting in Dublin at what they say are unfair rates of pay at the company. Gamma said it was writing to the workers in Turkish to explain how they could access money paid into Dutch bank accounts in their names. And now it's back to Brian in Rome.
Well, Eileen, with the announcement that the Pope's funeral will take place here on Friday, thousands of people from Poland have been making arrangements to travel here to Rome. Airlines in Poland have been struggling to meet the demand for seats, and there are some reports that up to 1 million Poles will be here in the Vatican City for the funeral later this week. With this report from the Polish city of Krakow, here's our Europe correspondent Tony Connolly.
Poland's period of national mourning is underway. Shopping centres have been voluntarily closing, as have cinemas and theatres. The Polish Stock Exchange has closed for 1 day and will close again on Friday. But in Krakow, the business of grieving continues. At the Archbishop's Palace, where John Paul II spent 15 years as Cardinal, thousands of people have been coming to pay their respects. Inside, priests were handing out sheets of paper to mourners of all ages to write down their thoughts as an alternative to books of condolences. By lunchtime, they'd already bound 6 volumes.
I write that we love him and we'll miss him.
There is natural disappointment that Pope John Paul II will not be buried here in Krakow. For many Poles, he joins a long list of illustrious Polish exiles who've died abroad. But the Polish Church is painfully acknowledging the fact that his rightful resting place will be the crypt at St. Peter's.
The place for the Pope is St. Peter's Basilica. One way or another has to be Rome, because he was the bishop of all universal church. Why should we have any special claim on his funeral?
Now there's a national imperative to get to Rome for the funeral. When the Polish rail company advertised extra trains, 1 million visitors caused their website to crash immediately. This travel company is desperately trying to cater for the huge demand. Isabella Vardega has just spent a month's salary to book her flight.
For me, he's now here for me, with us, but I would like to be there with him.
2 days after his death, it's a sentiment that millions of Poles share. Tony Connolly, RTE News, Krakow.
Well, I'm joined here in the Vatican by Father Tom Casey, who's a lecturer at the Gregorian University here in Rome, and by Father Gregory Waldrop, who's a Jesuit priest and lectures in art history. Father Waldrop, can I ask first of all, the scenes that we saw earlier this afternoon, you were down among the crowd as the Pope's body was borne through St. Peter's Square. What was your response? What did you make of what we saw unfold?
It was certainly impressive, and I have to say I was moved by the spectacle. The ritual procession itself is relatively straightforward, but it's the backdrop, the splendid piazza, the thousands of people, all the clerics, you know, in their hierarchical array, priests, bishops, cardinals. It made for an impressive sight, and I think everyone felt the emotion of the moment.
This, of course, was a pope who lived in the public eye, who was adept at using the media. We know that his passing was a public event as well, and now these final few days, his final journey, also taking place before the world.
Absolutely. In some ways, this pope who transformed the papacy by making it a more pastoral, evangelical kind of institution, here in these days we see the passing of a prince, really. Today, the body of the sovereign passing from his palace, from the sort of inner sanctum of his private chapel, where he was no doubt surrounded by those closest to him on Saturday, then Sunday in the Sala Clementina, where he had diplomats and Vatican officials paying homage to him, and now borne forth into the piazza, saluted by the people at large, and then brought into the Basilica where he'll lie in state, and, you know, perhaps millions will pass before him.
Father Tom Casey, what are the thoughts of those of you who've dedicated your lives to the Church at this moment of change in the life of the Church?
Well, there's great gratitude for Pope John Paul and the extraordinary contribution he's made. There's joy as well that he's in a much better place now than he has been, certainly in the last few months, suffering. And I have a great sense of hope and anticipation for the future.
Well, now, at his funeral on Friday, it is expected that we'll begin to get the first indications of how senior figures in the Church see the future, the post John Paul II era. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, the Cardinal who will celebrate the funeral mass is Cardinal Ratzinger from Germany, and for 23 years he's worked at the Pope's side here in the Vatican. He's in charge of doctrine and faith. He's Dean of the College of Cardinals, and although he may not become the next Pope, many people look at him as a key player, and his voice will have a big influence perhaps on who the next successful candidate will be.
Father Gregory, what do you think is going to be the influence, the impact of Pope John Paul's pontificate on those cardinals as they begin now to turn their thoughts towards the future, and who would be his successor?
I think in one way they're going to be looking for someone who can carry on in this capacity, to be able to reach out to many, someone who does have a facility with languages, who can continue the kind of international dimension of his papacy. But at the same time, I think they'll be looking for someone different, just in order to give the fellow a fighting chance of making his own mark, of being an individual. And so I do think they'll be looking for, to shift slightly in some way. We don't know exactly how, but some shift in personality or nationality, or in some way like that.
And Father Tom, a final thought on that?
I think one of the big issues will be collegiality. In other words, they don't want, a lot of cardinals and bishops don't want decisions made at the top if they could be made at the bottom. So in other words, to have perhaps a good dialogue between the Church in Rome and the local churches throughout the world.
So perhaps in a very real way the end of an era we're witnessing here. Thank you both very much indeed for being with us on the programme. That's all from the Vatican for this evening. Back now to you, Eileen, in the studio.
Thanks, Brian. Masses in remembrance of the Pope are being said tonight in various centres, including Carlow, Monaghan, Derry and the ecclesiastical capital of Armagh. In Belfast, the city's Lord Mayor signed a book of condolence and also expressed his regret at some of the graffiti which appeared over the weekend mocking the death of the Pope. Michael Fisher of our Northern staff.
Catholics in Northern Ireland had plenty of affection for Pope John Paul. In 1979, he had pleaded for peace, but was unable to cross the border because the security situation was so difficult. Massgoers at St Peter's Cathedral in Belfast prayed prayed for him and left messages in books of condolence.
Thank you, Lord, for the blessings of our Holy Father's life.
The passing of the pontiff was recognised officially with Union flags flying at half-mast at Parliament Buildings and Belfast City Hall. But in some loyalist areas there were signs of disrespect over the weekend. Many of the offensive signs have already been painted over, one of them with an apology. The graffiti writers were condemned by the city's Lord Mayor when he came to the cathedral.
I saw some graffiti yesterday and I was appalled.
The ecclesiastical capital of Armagh is one centre where masses are being held tonight for the Pope. The Northern Secretary, Paul Murphy, called to Archbishop Sean Brady and signed a book of condolence. The Archbishop's predecessor, Cardinal Cathal Daly, said the Pope's call on paramilitaries to end the violence in the north had eventually been heeded.
It took time, yes. I regret that it took so long and that so many people needlessly died. And there was so much deepening of the vision as a result of that long delay. But thank God it did happen. And Pope John Paul's words in Drogheda certainly made a major contribution to that development.
Dr. Daly will be among those attending the Mass in Armagh in just over an hour's time. But on medical advice, he will not be travelling to Rome, where cardinals are gathering. Michael Fisher, RTE News, Belfast.
Police in the north have